Okay, did everyone get a chance to sign in? Just make sure you click my name after you sign in. Okay, yeah. I'll give you a second. Okay, cool. So I'm just going to start off with a few announcements. So just to remind you guys, my office hours are Friday from 10 to 11 in the Academic Achievement Center in Rowe. And email me any questions you have. Some of you have emailed me about the recordings. The first two I didn't record, and the last one I forgot to turn on the microphone, so there's no volume. But I think it's going to work this time. So that should be up in the recordings folder soon. And then another thing I wanted to run by you guys is I have my notes from when I took this course, and I could also upload them into a drive on Husky CT. So do you guys think that would be helpful? I kind of have some condensed terms lists. You would want that? Okay, I'll run that by Redden tomorrow morning, and if he says it's okay, then I'll maybe make a little folder with that soon. So this week is the central nervous system, and then I think next week is the peripheral nervous system. So we'll get started with that. And the central nervous system is just the brain and the spinal cord. Okay, so here's a little comparison between the central and the peripheral nervous system. So like I just said, the central nervous system is just the brain and the spinal cord, and then the peripheral nervous system consists of all the other nerves that go out to the other muscles and organs of your body. So it includes sensory receptors, like the eye and the ear you'll get into next week. And neurons that receive and assign meaning to information. So here's a comparison of some important vocab. So these terms are different for the central and peripheral nervous system. The neuronal cell bodies, which are gray matter, are known as nuclei in the central nervous system and ganglia in the peripheral nervous system. The bundles of axons, which are the white matter, are known as tracts or fibers in the central nervous system, and nerves in the peripheral nervous system. So it's just important to kind of keep those terms straight so you don't get confused when talking about the two systems. Does anyone have any questions so far? Okay. So here's a comparison between white and gray matter. This can also get confusing. So white matter is white because the neurons have a lot of myelin around their axons, whereas the gray matter doesn't have as much myelin. So something else to note is the neurons that have a lot of myelin, the conduction is really fast in those neurons. White matter is internal in the brain and peripheral in the spinal cord. So that's what that image just shows. In the brain, the white matter is inside, whereas in the spinal cord, in the other image, it's on the outside. So it's opposite. Yeah, so then the gray matter is the opposite. It's peripheral in the brain, so on the outside in the brain, and then on the inside in the spinal cord. So here's just a breakdown of the 4 major regions of the brain. You got the cerebrum, which is the lobes, and these are for higher level brain functions. And then you have your 4 lobes, which are frontal, parietal, temporal, and occipital. And the right and left hemispheres of the brain are separated by the longitudinal fissure. So yeah, you got all 4 lobes that are kind of broken into 2 parts on each side. And then the diencephalon is kind of internal, inside the brain, and that functions a lot in homeostatic control. So you got the epithalamus, thalamus, and hypothalamus. And I'm going to go more into each of these on later slides. And then the brainstem is also known as lizard brain, and that's because it's responsible for a lot of like basic functions like breathing and your heart rate. So if you get any damage to your brainstem, it's pretty fatal, like bad, because that's like really basic brain functioning that goes on the brainstem. So that consists of the midbrain, pons, and medulla. And then the cerebellum is the purple in that little image in the corner. And the cerebellum is also known as like little brain. Okay, so now I'm gonna go into each of the lobes of the cerebrum. Does anyone know what the big like turquoise one is? Frontal, yeah, okay. So here's the frontal lobe. It's responsible for conscious motor control, speech, memory formation, hypothesis formation, personality, emotion, and planning and organizing. How about the purple one? Does anyone know what that one is? Yeah. So then you got the parietal lobe, which is spatial awareness and perception. And then the green one, yeah, occipital lobe, heavy on visual processing. And then the orange, yeah, temporal, hearing, speech, smell, memory formation, and retrieval. Okay, now we have the diencephalon. I couldn't find really a good image for this, so I just put them all there. So the thalamus is where all the sensory neurons synapse. So that just means that all the sensory neurons kind of like meet there and convene, except for olfaction, which is smell. And it filters the information here to prevent sensory overload. Because if we were taking in all the stimuli around us, we'd be like way too overwhelmed and couldn't function. So in the thalamus, it kind of like just decides what's important for us to like perceive. The epithalamus is the pineal gland, is the main part of it. And the pineal gland is responsible for secreting melatonin, which is a hormone that helps regulate our circadian rhythm, which is like our sleep-wake cycle. And last, the hypothalamus, it regulates homeostatic mechanisms. So what I was talking about before, the autonomic nervous system, endocrine system, body temperature, emotion, food and water intake, and circadian rhythms. And then if you follow the lines, you can see where each is located. Okay, brainstem. So first is the midbrain, and there are two like main parts. You have the cerebral peduncles, I think. So those are anterior pyramidal tracts, and they carry descending information to motor muscles in direct pathways. And then you have the Coropa quadramina, which is the four posterior masses. And the two superior masses are for visual reflexes, and the inferior are for auditory reflexes. Then under the midbrain is the pons. So this is the respiratory center, and it has cranial nerve nuclei here. And last is the medulla. So this is respiratory regulation, so regulates like your autonomic breathing. Like we don't think about that we're breathing, we just breathe. So that the medulla is responsible for that. Cranial nerve nuclei, and there are medulla pyramids, which are descending tracts of neurons, and they're anterior. Then the last part of the brain is the cerebellum, which is also known as the little brain. and this is responsible for coordination of movement, posture, balance, motor movements, and motor learning. So another big part of this chapter is knowing like the protection of the brain. So going from outside in, you got your skin, and then the cranial bones, and then the cranial meninges. And there are 3 layers to the meninges. On the outside, you have the dura mater, which is thick and fibrous, and it provides physical protection. There's a lot of blood in this layer. You have veins and sinuses. So sinuses are special veins with smooth muscle. And then in between the dura and the arachnoid mater, you have the subdural space. So the next layer is the arachnoid mater. It's thin and fibrous, like a spider web. It's kind of like a mesh. And then in between the arachnoid and the pia mater, you have the subarachnoid space, which is where the cerebral spinal fluid is located. And then another term is ventricles. Ventricles are what produce, circulate, and store the cerebral spinal fluid. So now we're like all the way inside to the brain. So the first layer that's right on the brain is the pia mater. And you could think of this as like a piece of saran wrap. It's really thin, and it like goes into all the groups of the brain. So here's some functions of the cerebral spinal fluid. It's involved in homeostatic regulation of ions and nutrients. We're going to talk about later the blood-brain barrier. So it maintains a different environment than the blood that's like special for the brain so it can function better. Is basically what that means. And it provides support for the brain. It allows the brain to be supported in kind of like a liquid because it's really heavy. So if it like wasn't in a liquid, it would kind of just be like not very cushioned, I'd say. And then it provides some immune functions. Kind of relating to number 1, it creates the ideal environment for the neurons in the brain. Okay, so here's, I don't know how much he gets into the production of cerebral spinal fluid, but I just listed it here for your reference, just to make it like simplified if he does. So it's first produced in the right and left ventricles, and then it flows into the intraventricular foramen. So if you follow the image, the right and left ventricles are really like in the center of the brain, and then it starts flowing down into the 3rd ventricle, and then it flows into the cerebral aqueduct to the 4th ventricle. So that aqueduct is just kind of like that thin space right there into the 4th ventricle. And then it goes to the brain or spinal cord. And it flows through the subarachnoid space, like we mentioned before. So excess cerebral spinal fluid is absorbed by arachnoid villi, which are, if you look at the top of the brain, like the little white spaces with the black arrows. And then it drains to dural venous sinuses, like we talked about before. So there are 2 main metabolic needs of the brain to produce ATP in order to function. You have oxygen and glucose. So something important about oxygen is that it's able to pass freely across the blood-brain barrier, and that the brain receives about 15% of the blood pumped from your heart. So that's like a very significant amount of blood and oxygen that goes directly to your brain. Glucose, on the other hand, needs membrane transporters because it can't pass freely through the barrier. and the brain consumes about half of the glucose in the body. So this is the blood-brain barrier. So this is what maintains the cerebral spinal fluid from having a different environment than the blood. So it's made of 3 main cells that make up together the neurovascular unit. First is endothelial cells. They have complex, tight junctions that eliminate paracellular transport. So that means that nothing could go like in between the cells. Everything that goes through the blood-brain barrier then has to go through the cell. So it has to go through membranes and it can't go around the membrane. Parasites are on the outside of endothelial cells. These integrate, coordinate, and process signals from the surroundings to regulate the flow of nutrients and waste. So they kind of just help regulate what goes through the endothelial cells. Astrocytes are specialized glial cells with feet. So they help promote those tight junctions between the endothelial cells. An endothelial cell, endothelial is just another like type of epithelial cell, if you're confused by the difference between endothelial and epithelial. It's a special type of epithelial cell. So here are the 3 main functions of the blood-brain barrier. It's to keep toxins out of the brain, maintain ion homeostasis, and maintain a low protein environment in the brain to prevent bacteria and viruses from having amino acids to proliferate. So, like we'll see on the next slide, there are different concentrations of ions within the CSF and within the blood, and that's just for these reasons, to keep the toxins out and maintain a better environment for the brain to function optimally. So here are the relative concentrations of substances in the fluid and in blood. So some important things to note are that glucose is lower in the CSF than it is in the blood. And this is because when glucose is in the CSF, it's used so fast because we need so much ATP in our brain that like right when it gets there, it's used and made to eat ATP. So that's why the glucose concentration is lower in the brain than in the blood. Sodium is also higher in the brain, and this just creates like a stronger concentration gradient to allow a faster depolarization. Protein, like we mentioned on the last slide, is lower in the brain to prevent bacteria and viruses from like being able to multiply really fast. And then water is also at a higher concentration in the cerebrospinal fluid. Here are 2 major arteries that supply the blood to the brain. You have the internal carotid arteries, and they supply the anterior or frontal portion of the brain, and then the vertebral arteries supply the posterior or back of the brain. So something else important to know is the circle of Willis. So this just ensures that blood can always get to the brain even if there's like a blockage of blood vessels because it's in a circle. So it ensures that the blood keeps flowing to the brain. Neurons in the central nervous system. The upper motor neuron is the brain to the spinal cord, pretty much, and then the lower motor neuron is the spinal cord to the muscle. And then just to relate this to the last unit, once that neuron reaches the muscle, we're at the NMJ, or the neuromuscular junction. Okay, that was like a lot of just like, I feel like this unit is a lot of just memorization and like new terms and stuff. So these slides are available to you guys if you want to go back and look at them. But again, I suggest to make a condensed study guide. So here are mine if you want to reference them. You can like zoom in, whatever, for this unit. Okay, I have a few questions. What region of the brain is also known as lizard brain? Yeah, brainstem. Cool. White matter is blank to gray matter in the brain, but blank to gray matter in the spinal cord. Yeah. Yeah. So, just to reiterate, white matter is internal in the brain, but peripheral in the spinal cord. The neurons that transmit information from the body toward the brain and spinal cord are called blank neurons. The neurons that transmit information from the brain and spinal cord to the muscles are called blank neurons. Does anyone know? Yeah.
Sensory and motor, like sensory versus motor second.
Yes. Sorry. Yeah. You're right. Yeah. So, like when you're touching something, yeah.
Could you also use afferent and efferent? Are those the same thing?
That sounds right. I could double check though. Wait. Here, I'll give you the next question while I. What brain structures are included in the diencephalon? Yeah, that is, you can use afferent or efferent too. Does anyone know this one? Yeah.
Is it the thalamus, hypothalamus, and hypothalamus?
Yeah. Cool. What space does the cerebral spinal fluid flow through in the brain? What two layers is this space between?
Subarachnoid space.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the pia mater and arachnoid mater.
Yes. Cool. Is glucose at a higher concentration in the CSF or the blood, and why? Yes. Higher concentration in the blood because ATP is used so quickly in the brain that glucose is depleted fast. And I kind of explained that in a different way on this slide. Like if you think about how many depolarizations are happening in the brain, how many neurons are firing at once, and the need of the sodium potassium pump to reset all these gradients, like ATP is used really fast. So glucose is depleted fast. Oh, I didn't go over this in the slides, but this is a question about it. Just to remind you guys, I don't go over like everything you have to know in the slides. What areas of the brain are included in the limbic system? Do you know? Okay. Does anyone want to? Yeah.
This is just a guess, but the amygdala,
Mhm.
hippocampus,
Mhm.
and
Two more. You don't know? Okay.
Is it the hypothalamus and thalamus?
Yeah. Thalamus, hypothalamus, amygdala, hippocampus. So the amygdala is responsible for emotion and fear. The hippocampus is for memory conversion, and then the thalamus and hypothalamus are members of the diencephalon that we went over before. Does anyone have any questions? Okay, cool. That's all I have for you guys today. Feel free to email me, come to office hours, or stay and ask me a question if you have one.